Hello, everyone. This is Ms. Sarah Bathioni with you today. We're starting a new episode, Unit 7, Lessons 1 and 2. Our topic of the day is all about sports. So I want you to visualize what kind of sports we're going to be talking about. Now we're going to jump to our learning objectives to get to know what we're going to be discussing. Okay, we're going to talk about basketball and tennis. We will read a magazine article about the history of basketball and tennis. We're going to use have to, had to, must, and mustn't correctly. Okay, so I want you to answer such a question. Do you often watch or play basketball or tennis? If you do, which one of these do you watch? You can write your answers down. Okay, now we're going to move on to question 2. When and where do you think these sports were first played? Now, if you're not sure about this piece of information, you're probably going to find it out on the next slide when we start reading. So let's jump ahead to sports history. This is a magazine article. So it is basically an article that was written in a magazine, and we're going to read it. We will be exposed to 4 vocabulary words, the ones in red, and we're going to answer questions afterwards after we guess the history of both basketball and tennis. Some experts believe that tennis was first an Egyptian sport because the word racket is very similar to the Arabic word rahat, which means hands. Other people believe that it was invented by the French in the 11th or 12th century. By the 15th century, there were as many as 1,800 indoor courts. So people didn't have to wait for good weather in order to play. In those days, players had to hit the ball with their hands. By 1500, the game was played with a wooden racket. The very first tennis balls were made from leather, filled with horse hair or wool. Today, tennis balls are rubber and have to measure 6.54 to 7.3 centimeters across the middle, and weigh 56 to 59.49 grams. Basketball was invented in 1891 by a Canadian PE teacher, James Naismith. In that year, he thought, I must find a new sport for my students to play in winter because it's too cold to play outside. The new game could be played inside in any weather. James Naismith tied 2 baskets to poles at each end of the court. A player had to throw the ball into the basket in order to score. At first, before the bottoms of the baskets were cut off, a player had to take the ball out of the basket after he or she scored. The game is now very popular, although you must practice every day to be good at it. Now we're going to look at the words in red. The first word is indoor, and the second one is courts. So basically, indoor is anything inside within space, inside an area. So anything that is indoor is inside, not outside. And a court is any place that is spacious or that has a lot of space where we can do anything we want inside. So any court is any place that has a large space. Poles are basically long sticks that can stand alone. So if you go out in the streets, you will find an electricity pole where you see lights in the street. So anything that is tall, it can be made of metal, it can be made of plastic, it can be made of any material that is hard. The last word here is score. So if I'm going to score, I'm going to get a goal, whether I'm playing basketball or tennis or even soccer for that matter. Now we're going to move on to the answers. Tennis possibly started in Egypt or in the 11th or 12th century in France. Okay, what about basketball? When did basketball start? Basketball started in 1891 in Canada. Okay, so now let's jump to Our next exercise, exercise 3, based upon the reading of sports history. Which of the words in red in the text mean the following? Now, the first one is done for us. Long bits of metal or wood. This is called poles. Now, what about places where a tennis or basketball match is played? So, any large space is called a court or courts. Now, what about what you need to do to win in some sports game? So, in order to win, what do you have to do? You have to score or get a goal. Okay, and number 4, any place that is inside a building or inside a room is called indoor. You can look those words up in a dictionary and then use them in a sentence. The more you use the vocabulary words, the faster you will remember them. Do not memorize them. You will just need to use them well to be able to remember them. Now I will move on to exercise 4. Answer the questions. Now, based on the text, number 1, how did tennis players first hit the ball to each other? So in the beginning, how did tennis players hit the ball to one another? They hit the ball with their hands. So they didn't even use any tools to hit the ball in the beginning. They used their bare hands without any tools. Okay, question 2. How have tennis balls changed over the years? In other words, how did the tennis ball material change over the years? What was it made of in the beginning, and then how did it change? So in the beginning, they used to be made of leather filled with horse hair or wool. Now they are made of rubber, which is a kind of plastic. Now we're going to jump, it's a soft plastic. We will jump to number 3. Why did James Naismith need to invent a new sport for his students? Remember, inventions are made when we are facing a problem or we have a certain need. So what was the problem here that Naismith needed to solve? He needed an indoor sport for winter because it was too cold outside. So his students were unable to play outside or outdoors because it was too cold. So he had to create a game or invent a game to help him and his students play indoor. Now let's jump to number 4. Where did he put the baskets? They were tied to poles. So the baskets were tied to poles from each side, right and left. Now let's go to number 5. Why did players take the ball out of the basket in the first basketball games? They had to because the bottom of the basket was not cut off. So in the past, the net or the basket took the whole space until the floor. So there was no place for the ball to pass under the net. But today, or nowadays, the basket is cut off, so there is space between it and the floor. So the ball can pass through. Now, we're going to start Unit 7, Lesson 2. I would love for you guys to underline the verbs used for obligation. So first of all, what does obligation mean? Okay. If I have an obligation or I am obliged to do something, it means I must do it or I have to do it. I'm sure your parents oblige you or they give you an obligation to visit your family members or maybe to do your homework or even to attend school. Sometimes you might not want to do it, but you must do it. So an obligation is a noun meaning something we must do. So let's look at number 1. People didn't have to wait for good weather in order to play. So did not have to or didn't have to is the verb showing an obligation. In this case, there is no obligation because we're using didn't. Let's look at number 2. In those days, players had to hit the ball with their hands. In those days, players had to hit the ball with their hands. What must the players do? That's how you know the verb that we're going to underline. Had to hit. This is the verb we're going to underline. Here, there is an obligation. They must hit the ball. Number 3. Today, tennis balls have to weigh 56 to 59.4 grams. Okay, what obligation must be done when creating the tennis balls here? we will underline have to weigh. So they must have a certain weight. In that case, have to weigh is the verb we will underline. Now, let's jump to number 4. I must find a new sport for my students to play in winter. In this case, we're going to underline must find. So this was something the teacher had to do. Okay? But it is his own choice as an obligation, right? Nobody asked him to do it, but he obliged himself to find a new sport. So we underline must find. Now let's jump to our favorite part, the grammar box. Okay, obligation and necessity. Obligation and necessity. Now, what do we use if we want to show an obligation to something or something that must be done? It's important. Have to, had to, and must. The opposite of that is mustn't, which means must not. We use have to or has to talk about rules or things that other people say are necessary. So if my mom thinks something is important, she would say, we have to go to school on time. Of course, this is a necessity. You must do it. She has to get a passport to travel to London. This is also a necessity because without the passport, you cannot travel. So you must do it. So in that case, we can use have to or has to. Have to is plural in this case, and in the second example, it is singular because we're talking about one person. Now, let's jump to the next point. We use don't or doesn't have to talk about things that are not necessary. She doesn't have to hurry. She isn't late for school. And of course, the next part is the past simple form is have to. The past simple form is have to, which is the same for all subjects. I couldn't go to the park yesterday because I had to finish my homework. This is in the past simple form. The negative of the past simple is did not or didn't have to, and an infinitive. We can say we didn't have to do computer studies when we were at primary school. It shows lack of necessity in the past. So if I say didn't have to play, didn't have to jump, didn't have to sleep early, that means it is a lack of necessity. Or we do not need it as it is not that important. Now, what about when we create questions? Make questions with question word did and the subject and have to and infinitive. Let's look at the example. How long did you have to wait until the bus arrived? Here we use did, and the subject here is you, and then we used have to, and then we use the infinitive wait or to wait. Now, we use must or mustn't plus an infinitive without to say something that is important to do or important not to do. You must see a doctor. You've been ill for a week. Here we used must see. Okay, what about the opposite? If I want to say that it is not important, I will say he mustn't park here. Or he should not park here. He mustn't park here. It's against the law. It's against the law. In that case, this is something important that he should not do. Now, let's create answers to our questions in the dialogue here. We're going to complete the dialogue with the correct form of have to. The first one is done for us, so let's read it together. Did you have to do PE when you were at school? Here we used did you have to, based on the words in brackets. Yes, we blank, but we blank do PE every day. So here we will say yes, we did, but we didn't have to do PE every day. Okay, let's jump to number 4. Blank do PE when it was very hot. In that case, we can ask and say, did you have to do PE when it was very hot? And of course, number 5, no, if it was very hot, we didn't have to do PE. So focus on how we use did, didn't, and didn't have. Now let's jump to our oral exercise or our dialogue. Here we're going to create questions about did and didn't. What did or didn't you have to do when you were a primary school student? Ask and answer about the following. Now let's look at the speech bubble on the right hand side in the picture. I didn't have to cook meals, but I had to get up early for school. So here I'll ask you, what did you have to do when you were at primary school? You will tell me, I had to do revision before my exams. Or we can say, what didn't you have to do when you were a primary school student? You might tell me, I didn't have to go to bed early. So create your own examples and practice with a family member on how to use questions such as did or didn't have to. And let's jump to our conclusion for the day. We have talked about basketball and tennis. We have read a magazine article about both sports and we learned more about their history and their origins. And we have also used had, hadn't, must, mustn't, have to. Thank you guys. You were awesome today. This was Ms. Sara Basuni. Have a wonderful day. I love you all.